Welcome to The Debate. Our source material today is, well, it's a fascinating, almost dizzying blend of history, mythology, and modern occultism. It explores everything from secret societies like the Order of the Dragon to complex Gnostic doctrines, and really centrally, the enduring archetype of the vampire. It forces us to address what happens when, intensely symbolic spiritual language runs headlong into claims of physical, literal control over humanity.
Exactly. And that tension leads us directly to our core disagreement today. Does this material primarily treat vampirism as a literal cosmological reality, external control by immortal entities, or is it fundamentally a profound metaphor for internal, psychological, and perhaps alchemical transformation? I'll be arguing that the deepest, most sophisticated layer of the text is actually rooted in the metaphorical and psychological view. And I think I come at it from a slightly different angle. While the psychological framing is definitely there, I see the sheer weight of the material, the specific claims about external hierarchies, literal bloodlines, physical energy harvesting, arguing that the authors are insisting on a hidden cosmological reality of control that underpins all the symbols.
Okay, well, my position relies quite heavily on the source material's deliberate foundation in the work of Carl Jung. The text extensively uses Jung's analysis of alchemy, framing the quest for the philosopher's stone, that legendary substance of perfection, as an explicit metaphor for individuation, or psychological development. It's the process where the soul achieves fullness by balancing its conscious and unconscious elements. That internal great work, that's the conceptual engine driving the entire document as I see it.
But couldn't that psychological framework, from my perspective, be what the controlling hierarchy uses to cloak or maybe even justify what the book presents as literal operational facts?
Well, I recognize the Jungian framework is foundational, but that only makes the contrast with the literal claims perhaps more striking. Consider the symbolism of the phoenix. It represents the rubedo stage. The text defines rubedo not just as, a nice symbol, but as the final phase of alchemical work. It signifies the regeneration of the human compound and requires the necessary death of the ego to achieve a transcendent state. This feels like pure internal allegory. The ego has to die so the integrated self can flourish. Even complex dualistic figures like Abraxas and Lilith are explicitly noted as archetypes. Abraxas symbolizing the totality of existence, merging light and darkness, Lilith representing the dark feminine, and, deep psychological aspects of transgression. The book itself seems to guide us toward the psychological interpretation as the central unifying concept.
I see the guiding hand, but I'm not sure I trust the destination it points to. The claims, they quickly explode beyond archetypal psychology into what feels like a literal, controlling, non-human hierarchy. The House of Abraxas is identified not merely as a symbol of duality, but as a literal, vampiric house that actively models the world. And it's not just a local phenomenon. The text claims this house possesses dominion over 365 parallel planets. Now, that doesn't sound like spiritual integration to me. That sounds like the physical reality of a cosmological oligarchy. And that concept of control is, materially supported by the text's central idea that humans are simply a farm for vital energy, providing a serum of youth for these controlling entities. This systematic energy drain is explicitly tied to archonic entities, the Countess, and the concept of the Demiurge, the lesser god trapping souls in the material world. Furthermore, the argument shifts entirely away from internal alchemy when discussing the Rito del Fénix. It insists on the absolute necessity of the Davidic bloodline for finding a perfect host. That requirement for a specific, literal, biological, genetic line for immortality, it suggests the physical reality supersedes any purely symbolic transformation.
Okay, that insistence on physical, material requirements brings us directly to our first major point of contention, the function and meaning of the Phoenix Rite itself.
Right. And you seem to view the Rito del Fénix as purely practical necromancy, yes?
Well, it is presented that way. While it borrows alchemical terms like nigredo, the blackening or death stage, and rubedo, it is explicitly labeled the vampiric rite of immortality. The goal, textually speaking, is material enduring life. And how is this supposedly achieved? Through the invocation of the demon Bifrons, a count of hell drawn directly from the Ars Goetia, the medieval textbook of demonology. The source material even claims Vlad Tepes, a historical prince, used the legendary Ring of Solomon to control Bifrons for this exact purpose. So, this methodology, relying on a specific named demon to achieve physical longevity, feels less like Jungian introspection and, frankly, more like high-stakes ritual magic. That is, I admit, compelling evidence for a literal practice. But let me offer an alternative reading of the same material. The very complexity of the ritual, detailing the classical stages of the alchemical work, nigredo, albedo, and rubedo, it suggests that the language of eternal life is inherently coded, wouldn't you say? Now let's look closer at Bifrons. The text meticulously details his dualistic nature, connecting him to the Roman god Janus, who looks to both the past and the future, thereby controlling cycles. Bifrons is also noted for mastery over astronomy. So perhaps the real insight isn't just the demon's name or his supposed historical manipulation, but the text's insistence that true immortality requires mastering the cycle of time itself. Bifrons functions here, I would argue, as a powerful symbolic figure controlling the cycles of time and opposites, and this aligns perfectly with the Jungian concept of unifying dualities to achieve completeness.
But that unification seems to come at a very material cost. The text states the ritual results in inmortalidad en el plano material, immortality on the material plane. I'd argue this physical goal, the actual continuous longevity, is the true goal, and the alchemical steps are simply the operational instructions for a physical transformation. The integration of the self, in Jungian terms, doesn't typically require consuming the vital essence of others. The literal act of vampirism, the consumption of blood or vital energy, seems to be the physical engine of this process in the text. It reads like a material requirement, not just a spiritual consequence.
Which leads us straight into the problem of the lineage of control and the nature of the archontes.
Exactly. That's a vital pivot point, because if it's purely psychological, why the need for these quasi-alien overlords? You seem to suggest these figures, Abraxas and the Archontes, and their connection to the alien lineage, often seen in modern science fiction, things like Jupiter Ascending or The Matrix, function primarily as contemporary allegorical vehicles.
Yes, I would frame it exactly that way. Look, the ancient Gnostics used Abraxas to represent the supreme, dualistic God. And Jung himself dedicated a sermon to Abraxas precisely because he is a combination and unifier of good and evil. He is a concept, a powerful one. So when the material references these modern films, it seems to me it's simply translating that ancient philosophical struggle against the prison of the material world imposed by the Demiurge, the ignorant creator god in Gnostic thought, into a modern sci-fi vocabulary of parasitic controlling entities. The underlying message remains Gnostic. We must escape the material realm, transcend it.
I'm just not fully convinced by that line of reasoning, because the source seems to insist on a material truth underpinning the myth. The House of Abraxas isn't presented as just a symbol. It's described as a vampire empire, and the text explicitly links esoteric control to literal lineage, stating that certain aristocratic families, like the Bathory and the Order of the Dragon, believe their pure blood makes them genetically chosen rulers. Now, that doesn't sound like psychological projection. It sounds like a literal belief in biological superiority enabling external control. And when the text draws parallels to films like Dark City, it doesn't feel like it's using them as mythic commentary. It feels like it's using them as confirmation that, quote, parasitic entities use living beings as batteries or food. This reinforces the idea that there is a literal hidden reality where our existence is defined by resource extraction, a kind of cosmological food chain.
But even the concept of the parasitic entity, the archon, is directly derived from the original Gnostic notion of the archons.
these lower, often blind entities preventing spiritual ascent. That's inherently a description of a psychological or spiritual hurdle, isn't it? Even when given, alien attributes in modern interpretations.
It arguably stops being just a hurdle when Vlad Tepes or the House of Abraxas requires specific blood, specific genetic material to achieve their goals. That slippery distinction between the allegorical archon and the material archont is, I think, the core tension here. And the material, from my reading, consistently leans toward the material, the literal.
Okay, this takes us perfectly into our final and perhaps most compelling point. How should we interpret the staggering historical claims made in the source material?
Right. The material links wildly disparate historical and mythical figures as one literal enduring reality, which definitely reinforces the cosmological view I'm outlining. Consider the suggested longevity of these beings. Saint Germain, a well-documented historical figure from the 18th century, is suggested to actually be Vlad Tepes, the historical model for Dracula, and possibly even the wandering Jew Cartaphilus. This continuity, where a historical prince somehow turns into an immortal, maybe even dimension-traveling vampire, it implies a single literal ongoing phenomenon. It's not presented as just a collection of stories. It feels like a hidden history that persists. But the most dramatic example of this literal insistence is probably the Countess Bathory. The text suggests she didn't just die locked away in her tower. It claims she faked her death and continued her blood rites, relocating to the Amazonian rubber camps. There, it alleges she was responsible for the ritualistic desangre, the blood drainage of 40,000 indigenous people. This is presented as a continuous, horrific fact spanning centuries, suggesting a physical reality of the blood rites as an engine for immortality, not simply a dark allegory of desire or transgression.
That is a powerful and, yes, deeply disturbing claim, and I absolutely recognize that such horrific historical details serve as incredible material anchors for the narrative. However, have you considered what these connections might mean thematically? The links drawn between Vlad Tepes, the Wandering Jew, and Saint Germain, could they not primarily emphasize the archetype of the condemned to wander and the immense burden of eternal life? Look, the core point of the Wandering Jew legend, as the text itself notes, is explicitly meditation on the weight of immortality and eternal punishment. By connecting historical figures to this archetype, perhaps the authors are using the literal facts of their existence, or alleged facts, to explore a profound philosophical question. Is immortality ultimately a blessing or a curse?
But if Bathory literally drained 40,000 people to extend her life as the text claims, that moves us entirely past the philosophical or allegorical value of meditating on eternal punishment, doesn't it? That becomes the material, physical requirement of the system described. The suffering is presented as real, measurable, continuous. It seems the text is using history as purported proof of a secret literal world, not simply holding up a mirror to human desires or philosophical dilemmas.
I agree that the suffering described is presented as real, absolutely. But the purpose, I'd still argue, of compiling these figures, Tepes, Bathory, Lilith, is to demonstrate the universal human struggle against mortality. It utilizes these extreme examples of occult pursuit as mirrors for our own darkest desires and the deep-seated urge to subvert the natural life cycle. The internal philosophical work, the death of the ego, the transformation of the self, that remains the true, higher goal sought by the true alchemists mentioned in the text. Physical longevity, in this view, is merely the outward, perhaps corrupted expression of achieving that inner philosophical goal.
And I would maintain that the internal philosophical work is merely the highly stylized esoteric language used by those who literally achieve physical immortality. It's used to cloak their resource harvesting, their farm, as the text puts it, from the rest of humanity. The psychological terminology becomes, in effect, the best defense mechanism for a literal hidden regime.
Well, this exchange clearly highlights the rich, almost contradictory complexity of the source material we've been discussing. I maintain that the material's intellectual strength lies in its profound ability to synthesize mythology and history to explore universal psychological themes. By utilizing the complex symbology of the phoenix, the Gnostic framework of the Demiurge, and the Jungian psyche, the text ultimately dissects the human condition and our eternal quest for self-transformation. The external battles described are, I believe, most compelling when viewed as a reflection of the internal ones.
Conversely, I find the relentless focus on literal requirements, the Davidic bloodline, the precise invocation of a specific demon from the Ars Goetia, the external archonic House of Abraxas, controlling parallel worlds, and the physical transfer of vital energy for prolonged material existence. All of this suggests a concrete, perhaps factual claim about a profound, controlling reality. A reality that defines human existence not as a path toward allegorical enlightenment, but primarily as resource extraction.
The fact that both of these strong readings are so heavily supported by textual evidence really confirms something important. Whether one views these concepts as purely psychological or cosmologically literal, a sophisticated engagement with these complex and often frankly terrifying narratives is absolutely essential to fully appreciate the depth of the sources.
Indeed. It seems the authors have deliberately constructed a work where the symbolic and the physical constantly overlap, leaving the ultimate question of truth, whether spiritual or material, purposefully wide open. There is clearly much more to explore within this fascinating convergence of myth, history, and occult science.